day for the next 30 days, I'm going to be posting a tip of what you need to know if you're an American who's thinking about immigrating to Norway. Day 1. We're going to file this under the subheading that I think a lot of these tips and days will fall under, which is that not everything is as utopian and beautiful as you think it's going to be, aka immigrating or leaving your country is not the quick fix that you think it's going to be. Now, I'm not trying to throw any shade at anybody because as somebody who moved here fluent in Norwegian and having studied the culture deeply for most of my life since I was a teenager, I probably also thought that it was just going to be a quick fix or something really simple. So I'm helping you learn from my oversights. Number 1, this is like the biggest one. Norway has its own culture. Stop. Replay it. Listen again. Norway has its own culture. For reasons I still can't quite figure out, there's this sort of global narrative that Norway is just this sort of vaguely white culture. A lot of Americans think that it is sort of America but better. I have a few theories about this. I'll just go over them quickly because it's not really the point. One is that there is a long history dating back to the British Romantic Victorians, Mary Wollstonecraft et al., of romanticizing the North, the Borealia, as this Anglo-Saxon paradise. And that has weird racist implications that to this day affect a subset of actually hard right-leaning Americans that think Norway is just super white, sort of the white Mecca, the land of their forefathers. Now, I'm a Victorian literature scholar, but I'm also a media studies scholar. And a media studies approach would suggest to us that maybe it's because there's just not enough narrative about Norway. When we hear France, we have an instant stereotype of how we think the French act. And Germany, same thing. Norway, we haven't heard as much about. So I think we just use it as what we call a palimpsest, like a blank slate, to project what we want to believe onto it. And then you bring in those sort of very old Anglo-Saxon paradise narratives, and you get people assuming that Norway is just like where they're coming from and that they can just pick up their lives and transplant it there and live exactly the way they lived. And that's no more true than it would be for anywhere. But for some reason, people don't really get this message. And I think they see Scandinavian countries on the list of high quality of life indexes and they just want to go over there. I know you're probably listening to me if you're a well-intended person and you're like, yes, I'm listening, I hear you, but I need you to really hear me. We would not make these assumptions if you were thinking about moving to China. You would be prepared for so much difference. I think even France, you would be prepared for a certain amount of stereotyped difference. And for some reason, Scandinavia just becomes this blank slate that people think there won't be any difference. What I see that resulting in is people coming over here and being really unhappy and complaining a lot about the culture, which they would not do if they'd moved to Dubai. They would actually be sort of more on their guard to be respectful of that culture because they would be aware that it's quite different. Norway is an old, we could say ancient culture. And because Norway was very isolated from the rest of the European landmass throughout most of history. Even Henrik Ibsen in the 1890s is writing about how Norway is treated like a cultural backwater. And it kind of was a cultural backwater, I'm sorry. It's even still to this day separated and more isolated than Sweden and Denmark are, not just from Europe, but from the rest of Scandinavia. They bus university students over to Sweden to buy groceries because it's cheaper there because stuff's just easier to get to. Why am I telling you this? What does it mean for you? It means that Norway was relatively insular throughout history, even more so than the other Scandinavian and Nordic countries, which also have their own culture. Norway's culture kind of remained sort of packaged the way it was, almost you could say fossilized a little bit. So when we talk about things like Yule, like a Yule log for Christmas, that comes from ancient Norse customs about the winter solstice and stuff that have affected the way we think of Christmas today, but also go to show that these cultures have really strong ties to their past. No, stop. That doesn't mean you should get excited and come over here thinking there's this sort of Norse neopagan thing that you're going to get to be a part of. It's not exactly that either. And even where that exists, that's not your culture to appropriate. I don't care if you have Norwegian DNA. you're not from here, that's not something we should fetishize, because that leads to the weird Anglo-Saxon racist assumptions we believe that affect Norway that I mentioned in the beginning. This is getting too long, and I think it's a theme that's going to be coming up and up and up. I'll go into the nuances of how that culture is different, but the first thing is to just take what I say, however much you believe it 200% more. It is a different culture. It is an ancient culture, and just because you don't know about that culture doesn't mean you're going to come over here and be able to just live the way you were living. In fact, it might be more of a surprise because there may be less narratives guiding you into what to expect in that culture. Simultaneously, thinking that you can just come over here and participate in some sort of idea you have of these ancient pagan Norse customs is only perpetuating the problem. So that's not really an answer either, and you're electing to come to a culture that has a long-standing culture which you will be expected to live alongside, but which you can't really meaningfully participate in fully without becoming a bigger part of the problem. And that itself is a huge cultural paradox that you're signing up to live in if you come over to Norway and maybe other places in Scandinavia. But we'll go into depth about some more of those differences as we go through this series.